Dad, and then the other guy, we can hardly get pictures from them, so I get, once every once in a while, so, don't have two for them. All right? But it just so happens we are in the beginning of another division of Proverbs, the fourth division of Proverbs, and these are the words of the wise men. And if you notice Proverbs 22:17, we have that, incline your ear and hear the words of the wise. And the wise there is plural, and so the wise men, some translations may have there. And it begins a new section. Now the Proverbs, of course, in the English translations, it doesn't come out as much, but actually you can see a little bit. If you have a newer translation that puts spaces between where they think there's a difference in subject matter, in my Bible, 22:17 is on the inside column of the left page, but if you compare that with the outside column of the left page, a lot of the verses are together more, and there's less spaces between the verses. And that indicates that the verses definitely go together by subject matter. Now, we've been grouping some of them together that are spaced out in some of the newer translations otherwise, but these, there's no doubt they go together because they're about the same subject. We'll see that as we go along. So that's one difference that you can see in the English translations, but a lot of the differences have to do with the Hebrew behind it and such that we don't get a whole lot into in this type of setting. But it is a distinct, different kind of writing style and such in the original language. And so it does go along with the new section that's headed Words of the Wise Men. All right? Now, first starts out as instructions to a young man, 22:17 all the way through chapter 23, verse 11. And introduction is an appeal for attention. Appeal for attention. And we can break that up a little bit there. Pay attention and take notice of wisdom. Notice in verse 17, incline your ear and hear the words of the wise and apply your heart to my knowledge. And that's a familiar type of verse in Proverbs. And then he reminds them of the pleasant consequences of following wisdom. For it is a pleasant thing if you keep them with you, let them all be fixed upon your lips. And so fixed upon your lips is the idea of put them into practice, and here the lips with speech. And before and yet future in Proverbs, he'll talk more about the tongue and about the lips and its connections with wisdom. Also, wisdom causes trust in the Lord, verse 19, so that your trust may be in the Lord. I have instructed you today, even you. And trust in the Lord is a result of following wisdom. We trust in the Lord more and more. Okay, and then and notice in verse 19 there, so that you may trust in the Lord. And then the latter part of verse 19, I have instructed you today, even you. And so with that, there is kind of a personal touch to that. A personal touch in verse 19, I have instructed you today, even you. And so these instructions must be taken personally, and it's kind of reminiscent of the New Testament verse in Hebrews chapter 3 and verse 13, for example. Hebrews 3 and verse 13, which is an exhortation, a book of exhortation. And let me get over there real quick and I'll read that. Hebrews chapter 3 and verse 13, but exhort one another daily while it is called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. Now, that passage in Hebrews is, could be a good summary statement for this proverb. The Lord says, I have instructed you today, and so it's for us to use today in our practical life, and when we put it to use, we'll exhort one another, but if we don't put it to use, we will not exhort one another, and we will fall, as the proverb warns against, or actually the Hebrews passage warns against, lest you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. And so this will help us to fear God and have a good relationship with God. All right, notice the next point there. Wisdom is personalized for us today. Well, actually, that's what we just talked about. Well, I guess that should have been 19a, and this should be 19b. And there's a passage in Hebrews, but it's personalized. It's meant to be put into practice. I think I made mention one time, not too long ago, of the Sermon on the Mount. A lot of people admire that as a beautiful piece of literature, which it is. But it's not meant just to be admired, it's meant to be put into practice. And as a matter of fact, there was a saying too that I came across recently. It's not how much you go through the Bible that counts, but it's how much the Bible goes through you. And in other words, the Word of God is not just meant to be admired, but it's meant to be put into practice and be a part of our lives. All right, and then verse 20, he repeats some of the instruction, have I not written to you excellent things of counsels and knowledge? And this, believe it or not, have I not written unto you, that's the only reference in the whole book of Proverbs that emphasizes writing. The only reference about writing in the book of Proverbs. All right, for whatever that's worth. And then verse 21, wisdom emphasizes the importance of being a reliable messenger. In verse 21, that I may make you know the certainty of the words of truth, that you may answer words of truth to those who send to you, or to those who send to you. And, you know, the idea of being sent and those coming to you, etc. In other words, in the process, and this would be how news would be gathered back in this day, before the instantaneous ways we have today, but this is how news would be taken and gathered. And so it's important that it was accurate. And that's part of the learning of wisdom and of knowledge. All right, then the next one, some admonition, things to avoid, chapter 22 through 28. And he starts out there by avoid oppressing the poor. In verse 22 and 23, do not rob the poor because he is poor, nor oppress the afflicted at the gate. For the Lord will plead their cause and plunder the soul of those who plunder them. Now the word poor here, and there's several words that can be translated with poor, and this word, according to sources, means defenseless, because of those who are defenseless, either because of poverty or because of some physical disability. And again, there's lots of instruction in the Old Testament period and in the New Testament about, you know, because these would be the most vulnerable of society and the most easily to pick on and to take advantage of. But he says, do not do that to them, nor oppress the afflicted at the gate. Now, at the gate was the place where justice was dispensed in that day and age. And so he's talking to those who have power to be in the gate. So he's talking about those with somewhat authority in society. But, of course, the principles would trickle down to all of us. And notice the Lord will plead their cause. In other words, He will be their advocate, and He will be their defender. And we do have a similar expression like that in Exodus 22:22 in the giving of the law. And again, the Lord has a special place in His hearts for widows and orphans and poor and those who are very vulnerable in society, and much is said about that in both Old and New Testaments. All right, and then the next one here is association with the violent people, verse 24 and 25. Make no friendship with an angry man, and with a furious man do not go, lest you learn his ways and set a snare for yourself. Okay? Now the angry and furious man is furious. This is a person who is very passionate, but yet easily loses his cool or loses his temper. And with that kind of person, do not go with. And the reason why, lest you learn his ways and set a snare for your soul. In other words, that kind of man, and there's been proverbs on that in the past, he'll get himself into trouble, and his mouth will get him into trouble. And so if we follow someone like that, we will imitate his ways, and we will get ourselves in trouble. Remember 1 Corinthians 15:33, evil companions corrupt good morals, or good, there are several translations there for that. But that's the idea there. It does rub off. And so stay away from those kind of people. Avoid those kind of people. All right, 26 and 27, avoid giving pledges or being surety. 26, do not be one of those who shakes hands in a pledge, one of those who is surety for debts. If you have nothing with which to pay, you should, why should he take away your bed from under you? And the idea of surety here, he talked about it in chapter 6, chapter 11, 17, and chapter 20. And we had a kind of a lesson on that 6 months ago or so. But what that is surety is being the guarantee of another's debt, guaranteeing another's debt. He says don't do that, because what happens in verse 27, if you can't pay it back, then everything's going to be taken from you. If you cannot pay, the creditors will seize anything that's of value. And we see all that today, and I don't know, even though they say so, I don't think the real estate market's quite come back yet, but maybe it's showing signs, I don't know. But that's the idea there. A lot of people were overstretched, and so the creditors came and a mess. But anyway, that's another story. All right, but don't avoid being surety, avoid guaranteeing someone else's debt. All right, the next one, removing boundaries, and this will come up again in this the next chapter. But verse 28, do not remove the ancient landmarks which your fathers have set. And Deuteronomy 19, that was one of the laws. Deuteronomy 19 and verse 14. Let me read that passage here. Deuteronomy 19 and verse 14 says there, you shall not remove your neighbor's landmark which the men of old have set in your inheritance, which you will inherit in the land that the Lord your God is giving you to possess. And this had to do with respecting people's property. Now, of course, in the Old Testament, which of course Proverbs is written under that law, they had those land inheritances, and those land inheritances were very important to the well-being of the tribe, all that, and all those tribes had to be kept exactly as they were, so that the Christ could come through that nation of Israel. And so that was a very, very major offense in the Old Testament, especially, is removing your neighbor's landmark, getting more land than what's due yours. And so do not move those landmarks. All right, and then verse 29 kind of goes better with the other verses there, at least according to the outline I'm using. And here's instruction, ways to advance. Ways to advance. Instruction and ways to advance. Now remember, this is instruction to a young man, as it were, in the beginning, but the principles are all here. And so the first one, be diligent in labor. Do you see a man who excels in his work? He will stand before kings. He will not stand before unknown men. All right, now, if you see a person who excels in his work, what he's saying is he will be rewarded for his work in this life. And, of course, also in the next, but the emphasis is in here. Now, he will stand before kings as he will be brought into the service of kings. Now, to stand before a king would be it'd be like serving, and not as a slave or that kind of thing, but, serving before kings. Kind of remind me, I went and saw that movie not too long ago, The Butler. Anybody see that movie, The Butler? I don't know if you saw The Butler. It's actually got somebody else's name in front of it, The Butler. Somebody else's butler, whatever. But anyway, it's about a guy that was, came out of, early 1900s, plantation or whatever. But anyway, he became a butler, and it's kind of like, how Forrest Gump, intermingled with a bunch of presidents, It was kind of like that, only it wasn't really a comedy, but, But he stood, and I thought about that, he stood before a lot of presidents. And, and then, of course, they depicted different presidents coming up. I guess the first one was who? Truman, wasn't it? Truman. It was Genie on Aladdin, that actor, what's his name? I forget. Yeah, Robin Williams played Truman. But anyway, but it just reminded me of this because, he would stand, with the tray with drinks or something, and then they would be talking about the world's business, No one else had access to what they were talking about except the butler and the big honchos in the government, But that's kind of what he's saying here. Do you see a man who excels in his work? He will stand before kings. He will be able to serve kings, very prestigious. But on the other hand, he will not stand before unknown men. And unknown men are men of no importance, basically. And again, it's showing there is reward for your labor. Work hard, and you will be rewarded even in this life. And there's application for all of us in this, but I tell preachers a lot of times when they graduate, if a preacher's always looking at the want ads, seeing what other preaching jobs are coming open, that's probably not a good thing, But I tell the guys, don't worry about that, man. Just roll your sleeves up, go to work, and the Lord will open doors for you. And if not, it doesn't matter. You're working for the Lord. You're not working for that congregation, this congregation, but you're working for the Lord, and ultimately, you'll be rewarded. And you look at guys like Joseph in the Old Testament, the patriarch. He was faithful with a little. God gave him a little more. He was faithful with that. God gave him a little bit more, a little bit more. And you see that throughout. And so Daniel, another case. So God will take care of us if we just work hard, go to work and roll up your sleeves and go to work. All right, the next one there is know how to conduct yourself in the presence of a king. Now, he's dealing here in the presence of a king, but again, the principles would apply either way. He says, when you sit down to eat with a ruler, 1 through 3, consider carefully what is before you, and put a knife to your throat if you are a man given to appetite. Do not desire his delicacies, for they are deceptive food. All right, so when you sit down with a ruler, and again he's saying if you're in high places, behave yourself. And, consider carefully what is before you. Now, we have an expression that kind of reminds me of this, but, don't act like you've never seen that before, Don't just go, oh, wow, man, and just go wild on that. But control yourself, have some self-control. To put a knife to your throat is the idea of don't be a glutton. Notice it says, the second line, if you are a man given to appetite. In other words, don't pig out at the king's table just because it's set out before you. Again, do not desire his delicacies, verse 3, for they are deceptive food. In other words, the king's hospitality, he may have ulterior motives to see what kind of person you are. I guess there'd be an application of Gideon's men, the ones that lapped like a dog versus the ones that did this. And, that's a way of sorting things out. But basically, if I were to sum that up, I'd sum it up by saying, don't act like you've never been there before, even though you haven't, but don't just go nuts because you have that situation, but practice some self-control. All right, and then verses 4 through 11, some more admonition, and this time things to avoid. And notice a lot of these start out with do not, do not, do not. And, do nots are just as important as do's, okay? Do not, avoid a fixation with wealth. Yeah, in verses 4 through 5, do not overwork. The New King James has, do not overwork to be rich. Because of your own understanding, cease. Will you set your eyes on that which is not? For riches certainly make themselves wings. They fly away like an eagle toward heaven. Okay? Now, he just talked about, being diligent and working and all that kind of stuff in the latter verses of chapter 22. But now he says, do not overwork to be rich. What do you suppose that means? Does someone have a different translation in verse 4? Do not overwork to be rich. Okay, weary not to be rich.
Weary not thyself to be rich.
Okay.
Labor not.
Labor not. Okay, and the idea there is don't make that your number one goal. Don't make that your number one goal. Because when that's the number one goal, of course 1 Timothy 6 kind of kicks in there and all that. But if that's our number one goal, then we are going to do all kinds of stuff that we otherwise would not do. And so do not overwork to be rich. Now, because of your own understanding, cease, it's kind of worded different in translations. Some of it says cease, you do not understand. In other words, a person thinks he understands that overworks to be rich. He thinks it's a good thing, but it's really not. Wisdom says it's not. Now, again, it's not wrong to be wealthy. He's not saying that. But he's saying when that becomes our focus, remember the passage in 1 Timothy 6, they that will be rich, or will, and that will be rich is not future tense of rich, but it's he that willeth, as some of the translations have. In other words, willing. If that's what your whole, focus in life is to be rich, that's where it comes into a problem. And of course, that's in 1 Timothy. Part of it's in 1 Timothy 6. Command those that are rich in this present age not to be haughty, nor to trust in uncertain riches, but in the living God who gives us richly all things to be done, etc. And, Timothy, anyway, he that wills to be rich. And, of course, this is my older Bible's got all the notes written in it there. But, anyway, what is it? 6:9, yeah, there you go. 6:9, but those, the New King James says, but those who desire to be rich fall into a temptation and snare. The other translation may have something like, but those who will to be rich, or will be rich. And again, it's not future tense, but it's those who desire. And again, it's their number one goal in life to be rich. Notice they fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and harmful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, for which some, having strayed from the faith in their greediness, and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. And that's exactly what this proverb here is saying in verse 4 and 5. All right? And then, of course, verse 5 is really, really good. Shows the uncertainty of riches. They just take wings and fly away. And you know that with your money when the bills come in, right? But anyway, the things we may count on financially may not be there. And so don't pursue something that's going to fly away, in other words. All right, any questions or comments on that? All right, the next one here is dining with misers. And maybe miser here, but could reword that. Well, actually, this is what it says, miser, that's why. All right, verse 6, do not eat the bread of a miser, nor desire his delicacies, for as he thinks in his heart, so is he. Eat and drink. He says to you, but his heart is not with you. The morsel you have eaten, you will vomit up and waste your pleasant words. All right? Now, miser here is one who is stingy, and some say the expression behind that literally means an evil eye, with an evil eye. But the idea behind a miser is he's stingy. And there's a difference between, we'll say being frugal, okay? I don't know if that's a good word or not. But anyway, and being stingy. And the difference would be, I guess, frugal would be you don't want to spend money unnecessarily. And then stingy would be you don't want to spend money at all, even if other people have to suffer or whatever, and you have it there to spend. And sometimes, some people get on to me for not paying someone to mow my grass, but I'm like, I'd rather save that 30, 40 bucks, spend on other stuff, like food or movies or, whatever. So as long as I'm able to, I'll do it. But I am in the process of trying to do a landscape, so when I get to be an old guy, I don't have to mow. It'll just all be one of those, take care of itself landscapes, But anyway, there's a difference between those two, stingy and one who's very frugal. All right, now here's the second time we're told not to desire somebody's delicacies. This time it's a miser. Before it was a king, up in verse 3. Now notice, for as he thinks in his heart, so is he. In other words, his thinking is stinginess. Now he says, eat and drink, but that's not what he means. And so in other words, it's picturing eating at a table with the miser, and he's saying, eat and drink. He's speaking words as if they're welcome. His guests are welcome, but they're really not, because in his mind, he's thinking about how much this is costing, and how he shouldn't be doing this, and this, that, and the other thing. And then when that comes across, verse 8, the morsel you have eaten, you will vomit up and waste your pleasant words. In other words, you will lose your appetite once you find out, or once his stinginess, his miserliness is exposed. And, usually if you're, if you have guests at the dinner table and you eat a meal and all that, there's good words, oh, that's a great meal, thanks, it's good fellowship and all that. But in this person's situation, it'll be like, that may be the way it starts, but then all of a sudden, makes you want to puke. Just put it in maybe our vernacular, but and waste your pleasant words. Okay, but and we often use 23:7, as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he, which is true as a principle. But in this context, it's talking about that person who's acting like eat and drink, but really doesn't mean it. All right, and then the next thing to avoid discourse with fools in verse 9. Do not speak in the hearing of a fool, for he will despise the wisdom of your words. Okay, so do not waste words on a fool. That's what he's saying here. And even if he did hear them, he wouldn't be able to put them to practice because of his foolishness. And it's kind of like Matthew 7, verse 6. Cast not that which is holy to the dogs, nor give your pearls to swine. Because they can't appreciate that stuff. And to them, it's nothing. They'll be trampled under by their feet and all that. And so it is with words to a fool. Do not waste your words on the fool. And of course, there's passages like that we do have to take into consideration sometimes. And again, as we said before, Proverbs are not 100% guarantees on things, but just generally speaking. And sometimes we do have to have some wisdom, like if we're studying the Bible with somebody, or we're trying to make conversation about scriptures and stuff, is sometimes we just have to brush the dust off our feet and move to somebody else, because our words will just be wasted. And, if there's someone else that's more, it's not necessarily saying give up on people, but I guess some people you can, in the sense that, at least in their present situation. But, we do have to have some wisdom on that as to whether we're wasting our words or not. All right, and then the next one here, verse 10 through 11, again, avoid moving boundaries. The end of the last chapter did mention that as well. Verse 10, do not remove the ancient landmarks, nor enter the fields of the fatherless. Now, enter the fields of the fatherless, in other words, don't take their land. Don't move your landmarks to take some of their land, for their Redeemer is mighty. He will plead their cause against you. Now, their Redeemer in this particular case is a reference back to God, who we had earlier in chapter 22. Let's see, around about verse 17, I guess it was, or somewhere, where it said God, the Lord, verse 23, the Lord will plead their cause, and a Redeemer pleads the cause of somebody. Now, this word Redeemer is like a kinsman Redeemer type. It's that word is used to refer to, like in the, remember someone was killed, the kinsman Redeemer had the right to go kill that person that killed his next of kin. And that's what the cities of refuge were set up. If he fled to the city of refuge, and he could stay there till he could be tried or whatever. And so that's really what that word Redeemer means. But in this context, since he's talking about God as the Redeemer, in other words, He is the one that will defend the fatherless, that He's already said earlier. And so, every time you see that word Redeemer, doesn't necessarily mean it's God. It could be just a kinsman Redeemer. But in this case, it is a reference to God. And the New King James even actually capitalizes that Redeemer, as some of the others may as well. All right, and then verse 12, another section here, additional warnings for young men, and this time avoid envy, verses 12 through 18. Now he introduces that in verses 12 through 16. Apply your heart to instruction and your ears to words of knowledge. Do not withhold correction from a child, for if you do, actually, verse 16, let me see that. An admonition there. Well, I guess the admonition, wait a minute, I'm way ahead of myself somewhere here. Avoid evil. Okay, well, let's just read that. Verse 13, do not withhold correction from a child, for if you beat him with a rod, he will not die. You shall beat him with a rod and deliver his soul from hell. Okay, now those two verses there, and there's a lot of verses that have to do with this, particularly chapter 13:24 we've already looked at, 19:18 we've looked at, and the Proverbs, and some perhaps think, and it's a very valid point, we could have studied the book of Proverbs by topics, but we'd miss out on a lot of stuff. But you could preach a good long sermon on just disciplining children just from the book of Proverbs. And there's nothing wrong with that. And again, it's not an excuse to abuse children, not at all, when it's done correctly. And the reason why you can't do it anymore is because people have abused it probably. But anyway, it's still a valid point here. All right. is, I'm sure, in our day. And so meat was kind of a luxury at times. And so a person who was gluttonous with eating meat, he's living high up and, very like that. But what does gluttony and drunkenness have in common? What is that? Excess, or another way of saying that is what? Lack of discipline or self-control. Lack of self-control. That's what those two things have in common right there, lack of self-control. And that's why they're both kind of grouped together many times. And again, verse 21, for the drunken and the drunkard and the glutton will come to poverty. And again, we've seen Proverbs on that, along with the lazy people and all that come to poverty. And we see it all the time in our lives. Now, the glutton we don't see maybe perhaps as much coming to poverty, but again, it's that lack of self-control. The wine, the drunkard, and, man, just a whole, kind of makes me want to look, a whole lesson on alcohol, how much damage alcohol does, over the years, man. I mean, to families, ruins people and all that. And, but anyway, they will come to poverty, and drowsiness will clothe the man with rags. And the drowsiness is the result of drunkenness and gluttony. And again, the drowsy person is depicted as one who doesn't work, doesn't get up to go to work and all that, can't keep a job and all that. And so you see where he's going with that. All right, then the next one there, avoid immorality, 22 through 28. Introduction to that. Listen to your father who begot you, and do not despise your mother when she is old. Buy the truth and do not sell it, also wisdom and instruction and understanding. Okay, well, stop right there just a minute. Now, of course, buy the truth and do not sell it. In other words, and here's a quote from James Smith. He says, "Truth is the highest value, and one should spare no pains, cost, or sacrifice to obtain it, and then keep it safe. And then so also with wisdom, instruction, and understanding." In other words, the truth is to be valued very, very highly. In fact, our lectureship in January is, Do You Understand Truth? And we'll talk about truth, but it's to be valued. It's to be treasured, bought, no matter what. And it's kind of like the parable, remember Jesus, the man finds a buried treasure in a field, and what does he do? He goes and sells all that he has so he can buy the field. And that's the way wisdom is. Now, the three things after that, wisdom, instruction, and understanding. Wisdom and instruction have to do with perception and practical knowledge of truth, whereas instruction has to do with being trained in truth. And so all those terms go together. All right, verse 24. Well, let me get there. 24 there. The father of the righteous will greatly rejoice, and he who begats a wise child will delight in him. Let your father and your mother be glad, and let her who bore you rejoice. My son, give me your ear, and let your eyes observe my ways. And that's one of my favorite passages in Proverbs, because that passage there says that we have to teach by example as well. Notice, let your eyes observe my ways. And for parents, us parents, that's a pretty sobering thought that we teach by example. And so our example should be what God would have it to be. All right, real quick, let's get through these next couple of verses so we can pick up with the drunkenness on next time in verse 29. All right, notice observation, verses 27 and 28. For a harlot is a deep pit, and a seductress is a narrow well. She also lies in wait as for a victim, and increases the unfaithful among men. All right, now the harlot here, and he's had a bunch to say about that in chapter 2 and chapter 5 especially. Also in chapter 9, there was some stuff there. But in other words, she is a deep pit, a trap, leads down to Hades. And this seduction is as a narrow well. Now, a narrow well is a hole that if you fall in that hole, you can't hardly get out. And I kind of got this, fear in my gut when I was studying up on this a while back. But, if you fall in a hole that you can just fit like this in, and that's it, how are you going to get out of that? A narrow shaft. And that's what this harlot is. It makes me feel like I'm suffocating just thinking about it. And that's what this seductress is. She lies in wait for a victim. In other words, just like a You know, something that's hiding in the bushes ready to bushwhack you. That's what lying in wait is there, to bushwhack, and increases the unfaithful among men. In other words, when men fall for her trap and commit fornication with her, she increases the unfaithful. And the unfaithful among men there is probably referring to husbands that, you know, commit adultery and such. But there's a warning there to stay away from that. And then here, avoid drunkenness. And I don't know, yeah, I got that up there. I don't know how well you can see that. But we'll talk about that next time. I guess it's kind of dark. But anyway, that's how they would make wine. And we'll go over that a little bit in connection with this because, you know, when is it intoxicating? Okay? You know. But the word wine is used for every different stage that you'll see up there. And we'll get more into that next week. All right? Any questions or comments? The bell rang, so we'll go ahead and go.